Welcome back, everybody. Let's take a look again at the um, playback engine. Playback engine, remember, is found under the Setup dialog box, Playback Engine. This is where you can change the hardware that Pro Tools is using. Here you can see I've got a variety of options, including my webcam or the regular analog or digital outs of my computer. Obviously, I'm using my AES16E card, which is a professional card that links to my A to D and D to A device. So this is where you check that. Remember your hardware buffer size. This determines how much latency you have. Okay, lower latency, smaller buffer sizes are used for recording. Large latency or large buffer sizes are used for mixing, therefore giving your computer more time to process all of the data, including plugins and different things like I have in this mix. You can see all these different plugins that I'm using in this mix. So we need to give Pro Tools and my computer as much time as possible to process all of that data. Speaking of hardware buffer size, your hardware buffer size will also affect things like how many tracks you can have simultaneously in your session, the number of tracks you can have record enabled, the number of plugins you can have on tracks, as well as the amount of virtual instruments you can have in your session as well. So all of those things will be affected by your hardware buffer size. Let's look now at the disk playback cache size. What this does is it allocates memory for Pro Tools to pre-buffer your audio. So in other words, all of your audio that's on the hard drive will be loaded into this cache, depending on how much you have. If you have sufficient cache size, you can load your whole Pro Tools session into your RAM. What that does is it gives you faster response. So playback and start times occur much faster if everything's loaded into RAM. That's a much faster way of processing than is streaming the audio data off of your hard drive. You probably remember from Pro Tools 101, we spent a little time in the I/O Setup dialog box. So that's under Setup, I/O. And you remember there's multiple tabs here, each containing different information. This information is all based on what you have selected for your playback engine. So if I select for my playback engine the digital outputs of my computer, it's going to give me a lot different inputs and outputs based on the capabilities of my computer. Since I'm using this external card, it's going to give me 16 inputs and 16 outputs because that's what's capable on this particular piece of hardware. So your I/O setup is specific to the hardware that you're using. So if you ever get a situation where things just don't look right, or you're not seeing any inputs or outputs, or there's some kind of problem, it's always safe to come over here to the I/O setup after you've made sure you've got the correct playback engine selected, and then go Option and hit Default. What that does is it sets everything back to the defaults based on what's selected in your playback engine. So now I've got all of the standard defaults for the hardware configuration that I am presently using. You remember that you can rename buses by double-clicking and then using the Tab key, which I'm doing now, to move through those if you want to rename them or custom name them. Same thing with the inputs and outputs. You could double-click on these. You could name them or rename them and use Tab to move forward through all of them. If you would like to delete some of the buses, you can certainly do that. It's fairly easy. Let's say I want to get rid of some of these buses that maybe I'm not using anymore, like this one here. Just click on it and hit Delete Path. If it's currently being used, it'll give you that dialog box like we just saw. You can also see it's being used by the fact that it's bolded. So if I delete these two, again, it just deletes them, doesn't give me any warning, just lets them be removed from my session. So you can add and remove buses very easily. Let's go ahead and put this one back in, 19 and 20. So we'll add that bus back in. And there it is here. And we can move it back and place it where it needs to go. Also, you can rename signal paths, either here in the window. So let's rename bus 9 and 10. And I'm just going to call it Todd 9 and 10. If I click OK, and then I go to the mixer edit window and I try to bus something, you can see there's Todd bus 9 and 10. Okay, so we can rename it there. We could also right-click on it and rename it if we had it selected. So let's go ahead and select this bus. See, Todd bus 9 and 10. Okay, now we could just right-click on this as well and hit rename and name it back to what it was, which was bus 9 and 10. And you'll also notice that once we've done that, get rid of this, go back to my I/O setup dialog box, and you can see bus 9 and 10 is back and it's been renamed. So whatever you name in the I/O setup dialog box or in the sends or any of the input or output selectors will be renamed in the I/O setup dialog box as well. Also on the Output tab of the I/O Setup dialog box is the Monitor path and the Audition path. You remember in Pro Tools 101 we discussed this briefly. The Audition path is where you can audition audio from the workspace window, also where you can audition fades. So when you audition a fade in the fade dialog box, the audio is going to come out the audition path, whatever you have selected here. So it's important if you're not hearing any of your loops in your workspace window, for example, or workspace browser, come here to the I/O Setup dialog box and make sure your audition path is set to the appropriate output.